about you?
Griskevich.
Griskevich. I knew it smarter. Meg received her bachelor's degree in livestock science and management from West Virginia in 2012. She graduated with a minor in agricultural business and won a statewide entrepreneur contest as a senior. Her entry was a patentable design for video-assisted artificial insemination of cattle. After graduation, she interned with our speaker tonight, Greg Judy from Missouri, came home to Western New York and started the Rhinestone Cattle Company, LLC. She's raising and custom grazing 100% grass-fed beef and breeding stock on leased land. Her vision for her cattle company is to be a resource to regenerative cattle grazers through using and teaching principles of low input management and grass genetic development. Meg wants to help new farmers get started by creating a reproducible model for growing full-time profitable businesses from scratch. Please join me in welcoming Meg.
Well, hi everybody. I'm glad to see you all sitting here listening to me talk. You wonder why it's called Rhinestone Cattle Company? Well, because I couldn't exactly name it after my last name the way a lot of people do. So everybody would be like, well, I'm going to buy some cattle from that place that I can't pronounce her name. Anyway, so I want to get to know you guys a little bit first so I know who I'm talking to. How many of you guys out there are beef producers? Show of hands, please. Okay, so most of you. Who has sheep and goats? A good number. And pigs? Pastured poultry? Okay, so it is mostly beef cattle people out here. What about dairy? Any pastured dairy? Okay, looks like one farm. Anyway, a little bit about me. I think that my introducer has already said almost everything important. I did not come from a farming background, which I think was an advantage because I didn't grow up in love with conventional production and with my paradigms already aligned toward that. I went to college where they taught me basically how to raise 1,700-pound Black Angus cows on as much grain as you can cram into them and figure out how you're somehow going to make money off this. I went and saw Greg speak at a conference in Morgantown while I was in college, and that's when I heard the gospel of grazing for the first time. And I went to work for Greg as an intern, and here I am now. So I am up in New York State in Allegheny County on leased land, raising some Red Angus and South Pole Cross beef cattle. And I'm going to be talking a little bit in this presentation about how my plans are changing this year because I have figured out that what I'm doing is not working so well. Just a side note that the handout that is in your packet, there's been a few changes made to that since I printed the handout. And so I added a slide here and there and maybe changed a couple words. Nothing serious. But the cover picture of me with the big fan of cash and the sunglasses, my dad saw that and he says, "You are not using that picture, are you?" Now, I thought it was funny. It was when I sold a truck, I was going to pretend I was a rap star or something, but he didn't think it was that funny. I don't think the clicker's working too well. Is there a trick to this? It wants to go backward, not forward. Okay, there we go. So in the traditional cow-calf operation, what I define as a traditional operation in this presentation would be having a year-round operation where you're keeping your cows year-round and you are selling your calves either in the fall at weaning weight or you're selling them in the spring as yearlings. And you're keeping the same size herd through summer and through winter. And we know that it is a great way to build a long-term asset and have an excellent retirement auction someday, but if you're in this business trying to maximize cash flow, that can be a problem. I'm not going to talk about these things that we are already here talking about and the other speakers are covering in much more detail. Things like management strategies, grazing, and genetics. As Greg and Teddy have going to cover that in much better detail than I will, with much more expertise. So what I'm going to talk more about is how to structure your business, because I think that's something that does not get a whole lot of attention at some of these conferences, and it's just as important as the management side of things. When I got started out, I thought that all I had to do was become an excellent holistic manager, and I was going to make all kinds of money, and it was going to be great. I figured that I was just going to be so far ahead of all the conventional guys who are just buying tons of inputs. Well, it turns out that's not quite enough. So over the past 5 years, I have been working on whole tons and tons and tons of projections and numbers, which I was scared of at first and I didn't want to do. trying to get back to that last slide here. The second one. Third one. Yeah. So over the past 5 years, I am standing before you having done 31 pages of spreadsheets, 23 pages of Microsoft Word documents, and at least that many pages of just notebook scratch pad stuff. And at one point in my apartment a couple years ago, I was sitting on my floor and I had about 50 to 100 little sheets of note paper, little post-it notes on my floor that each represented an animal, and I was doing stock flow projections. So I have done the hard work and I'm here just to summarize it. So I'm going to try to cram a whole lot of information into a really short period of time. I had to make at least one car analogy on this presentation so that my boyfriend would pay attention here. So this is going to sum up the mindset with which I want to go through this presentation. So you start out with your overhead items and your raw materials, which would be your grass, water, sun, the stuff that you have in order to give an animal. The tools in the middle are the animals. You need the right tool used the right way, which is the right age and class of animal managed for under the right circumstances and sold into the right channel at the right time of year. And so the end product that you come up with is the money. Now for me, in this mindset, the animal is not the end product. The money, the profit is the end product. Because in this mindset, I'm focusing on cash. Now for some of you, I know you have different goals, where just the lifestyle of farming and the raising of animals in an ecologically responsible way, that is your end product. Now I'm not telling you you're wrong, but that's not really what I'm going to focus on today. And so this works with the car analogy because you would start out with a whole different pile of parts and use the right tools the right way and come up with a finished car. Now the first problem I see with the traditional cow-calf operation is that we have a whole ton of grass that is being eaten by animals that are not being sold and are not generating cash income in any given year. Now with an automotive plant, say they make 100 cars, they're not going to take 70 of those cars and park them out back someplace and just sell 30 of those cars. They're going to sell every one of those cars. Now I know that in a cow-calf operation you can't sell every one of your cows or you will end up with no cows. But this is kind of a startling figure for me, and I bet a lot of you have not ever seen this, that 60 to 70% of your grass under a traditional cow-calf operation stock flow plan goes into animals that do not get sold. And so your cash income is represented by only 30% of your grass carrying capacity. Not only do these animals, 70% of them, not get sold in any given year, so they don't represent any cash income for that year, but these are also the ones that you have to keep over the winter. And these are also the ones that eat the winter hay. And so this is a double whammy. This quote came from a study on cow feed efficiency, and it backed up what I had already kind of figured out on my own, so I was glad to see that. That 70% of your feed inputs for a slaughter animal, when you're talking about cow-calf to finished production, go into the maintenance requirements of both the cow and the meat animal. Now a lot of that is used by the dam because she is a higher weight. And so if you stop and think about how much of your grass, which you have a set amount of, is going into just being burned by the maintenance requirements of a cow, that's quite a lot. And so if you don't have a cow herd, if you're focusing on stocker or finisher production, if you're focusing on freezer trade or direct marketed meat, you can have a lot more stockers and finishers if you don't even have a cow herd. So I want you to ask yourself, do you even need a cow herd? I want to go through two projections here of examples in which having a cow-calf herd is a good idea versus not so much. Because when you have a set amount of grass, and if you are using some of that to go into cows to produce calves, you're taking that away from animals that you could be using in your primary enterprise to selling meat. And so there are two conditions that have to get met if having a cow-calf herd is going to be a good idea for someone whose primary focus is on selling meat. First of all, your cow herd cost, when you split those up per calf that you get out of it for meat, needs to be much less than the cost of buying the weaned calves. And so what it costs you to keep that cow herd, when you factor that in, needs to give you an animal at the stocker point or the finisher point that is cheaper than you could buy it at. Not only does that advantage have to exist, but that advantage has to be so great that it makes up for the carrying capacity loss that you're using for the cows instead of using it for meat animals. And so you must not be able to generate more cash by just having all of your land used for meat animals than you would with having the cow herd. So this may not make a whole lot of sense at this point. Hopefully it will make sense now when I put these numbers up on the screen. So I used a 30,000 pound carrying capacity farm for this projection, since that's what I've calculated my carrying capacity to be right now. So that's just kind of a go-to number for me. And so here's two different options for what we could do as a stocker or finisher operation with this amount of grass. On the right-hand side, I figured out that with stockers that are 800 pounds at the end of the growing season for this stocker operation, you could hold about 38 of them on this carrying capacity farm. And so say that you would purchase those for about $700 a head, you would have maybe 100 into them for a mineral or this, that, and the other thing. Sell them for about 1,000 in the fall, and so your gross margin, which is your income minus your direct production expenses, would come out to be about 200 a head. Now, I don't call it profit because profit is what happens when you take your gross margin and then take your overheads out, and then you call that profit. This way of structuring you're looking at your enterprises and your business structure, I learned from the Ranching for Profit School. I'm going to talk about that a little later on. So if we have 38 stockers on this 30,000 pound farm, so we're using all of our grass to raise those stockers, you're going to end up with about $7,600 before you take your overheads out. Now if you were to have cow, calf, and stocker, and you are stockering your home-raised calves, I figured out that with pairs that are about 1,500 pounds at the end of the growing season, plus those 800 pound stockers at the end of the growing season, your maximum number of cattle that you can have is 13 pairs and 13 stockers, if you were to grow out all of those stockers instead of using any for herd replacements. And so long story short, you end up with about $7,150. So in this projection, you are losing money by having cow-calf instead of just using all of your land for your main centerpiece enterprise. Now, this may not seem like a big deal to you, a couple $100, because you know that there are headaches involved in buying animals instead of just raising ones at home. But where this might really be an advantage is when you take into account your overheads. Because at least in my operation, the overheads involved in keeping animals over the winter are a huge part of my cost. I'll talk about that more a little bit later too. So here's another projection for pretty much the same plan, but in this one, we have knocked the wintering expenses way down. In the last one, it cost about $350 to get a cow-calf pair through the winter. Now in this one, I called it $200 to get a cow-calf pair through the winter. And so in this projection, it actually does make more sense to have your own cow-calf operation as a feeder enterprise for your stockers. And so this is going to have to be on an individual farm basis. It's really hard to stand up here and tell you that this is what you should do because everybody's operations are so different. But the keys in order to making this work is that if you want to have cow-calf as a feeder enterprise for stockers or finishers or meat, your overwintering costs need to be basically negligible. It's either that or it must cost you so much to buy stockers that you know that you can't raise them for less. Now I want to bring up the overhead costs again on this because I'm assuming that the stocker operation is going to be a seasonal thing, whereas cow-calf would be year-round. And so you would have to figure in the overhead costs involved in equipment for winter feeding and freeze-proof water and stuff like that too. So that may negate the advantage to having cow-calf, depending on what happens on your individual farm. So here's the next question I have for you. Even if you do decide that you don't want to focus on stocker and finisher and you really do want to be a breeding stock and cow-calf type of operation, you still don't have to be year-round. So we all know what the disadvantages are to being year-round. The fact that overwintering in areas with wet climates are really destructive to your land. No matter how hard you try, you're still going to get some mud. And so you'll either have to take a carrying capacity loss and a dry matter loss on those wintering areas for a year or two while they naturally recover, or you're going to have to plow them up and reseed them and fix them, and that's going to be a huge expense. And our growing season up here is shorter than it is in other parts of the country. We have heavy wet snow and a lot of ice, and that cuts back our ability to stockpile as well as some other locations in the country. And here's another interesting thing that I figured out while I was doing pages and pages and pages of stock flows. So I used to think that all I had to do to make money was to get a big operation. I needed a couple hundred cows and I was going to be making money. Well, the more I did these numbers, the more I figured out that if you are wintering the entire herd that you have over the summer, your wintering costs and your overhead costs and everything is going to keep right up with that revenue. So the more money you make, the more money you end up having to spend, and so you end up right in the same boat. I don't know about you, but I would rather make like 20 grand on 200 acres than have to run 500 acres to make that same 20 grand. It just is a whole lot of work, and I'm one person. So I'd rather do it on the smallest scale operation as possible. So I am this year going to be not wintering. And I'm going to bring up a few options for what you can do if you don't want to winter. But this breaks down farther what the problem really is with wintering. Now, the gross margin per pair is what you would get with revenue when you sell that calf, minus what it has cost you to keep that cow and that pair for the amount of time that you have it. And so as you can see, the gross margin per pair is growing steadily throughout the growing season and the stockpile season while you are on forage that does not cost you anything to store and to feed. And the month change in gross margin, which is the value that that calf gains during the course of that month, is green and is positive throughout the growing season. But once you get into where you have to feed stored feed, if you have a situation where it is costing you more to maintain that pair through those months than the value that that calf is gaining, you're actually going backward, and so it's not doing you any good to be wintering. So that's something that I'd like you to pay attention to. You will profit more by cutting out any months in which it costs you more to operate than the gain that you produce by operating. So here are some ideas for how to avoid winter. I'm going seasonal this year, and I think that it's a great thing to consider in this part of the country because you can have a higher carrying capacity on the same amount of land if you are not trying to squeeze an extra few months of grazing out. I need a lot less infrastructure, and I think a lot of you would too, because you don't have to have winter shelter for your animals. You don't need to have concrete feeding pads. You don't need to have feeding equipment. You don't need to worry about getting hay, either bought or made during the summer. You don't have to worry about moving manure, and the mud is a big thing for me. I really can't stand mud. And winter is the time when you're going to have a lot more animal health issues in the summer, so there's that to consider as well. And what I found when I did these pages and pages and pages of spreadsheets this past few weeks is that I can be as profitable or more profitable being a seasonal operation than I can be over the winter if I were to be year-round. So this is blown up in your packet, the last sheet on the handout. This is the conclusions that I've come to after all of my projections this winter. So here's all the ideas that I think that we have for breeding stock operations. On the top, we can have year-round flip ideas where you are buying and selling a new group of animals every year. It is still a year-round operation, but in this case, you are using 100% of your grass toward an animal that produces cash income in that year. So you don't have that loss in non-productive animals. There are summer flips, which are just seasonal projects. You could do just winter flips and do 2 flip groups a year, but I didn't think that there was any point in trying to do just a winter plan. And then there is year-round raised plans, which are more of your traditional cow-calf operations. And under the year-round raised, I put down all the different categories of things that we can maximize the sale of. Anything from calves up until yearlings or bred breeding stock. And the yearling and the 2-year classes also include bulls and males in those. And then in the bottom we have plans where you can actually focus on keeping your young stock and selling your cows, which I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Anyway, what I want you to see in this is under that gross margin before overheads category, there is so much difference in how much money you can make off of the same amount of grass based on what tool you use in what way. At the bottom there, what most people do who are traditional cow-calf operators, you're selling weanlings or you're selling yearlings, and so it looks like I can make between $9,000 and $1,300 or $13,000 if I were to go use this plan on my operation. But my overheads I've calculated to be about $10,000, and so that really wouldn't get me very far if I were to choose those plans. Now up at the top with the year-round flips, mainly due to the increase in carrying capacity, even if I was buying and selling animals every growing season, I have the opportunity to make as much as $20,000 to $30,000 on the same farm. There is one plan in there where I think that the projection is $1,600. So I could be anywhere from $1,600 to $30,000 on the same piece of property. In the other column right there where it says percentage of carrying capacity that is non-cash producing, under those flip plans, only a very small, if any, amount of grass is being used for animals that don't generate cash in the same year. But under the traditional year-round raising plans, where you're not flipping anything and you're just raising everything at home, up to 60-70% of your grass is not generating cash, like I've already talked about. So that's a huge difference between these production plans. So here are some of the keys to flipping successfully. First of all, don't depend on pounds of gain for profit. You need to have a value change in the animal while you own it. So I don't know very many people who are successfully doing gain-based enterprises with selling in the spring, or buying in the spring and selling in the fall, because we all know the prices are a whole lot lower in the fall than they are in the spring. And also, when your animals get bigger, their price per pound that you can get for them goes down. So that's two factors that are working against you there. So you want to have a value change, which mostly represents breeding. So what I'm going to try to do this year is to buy open heifers, get them pregnant, and sell them in the fall. And so that calf being inside them represents a material change in the value. You could also do this with meat animals, where you buy something that's live and process it and direct market the meat. And so that represents a value change too. What I want you to harness in this flipping philosophy is this chart over here on the left shows the breeding value of an animal from the time that it is born up until the time that it's really old. And so as you can see, they appreciate for a while up until they become a young cow that has had her first couple calves. And then after that, her value progressively declines as her years of useful life dwindle away until you are left with something that is practically worthless. And so you don't want to be buying and selling animals that are on the downside of that scale. You want to be buying them on the upside and selling them while their value is still increasing. So here's a way that you could really get ahead with flipping. If you have a flip plan that does not take you an entire growing season to produce one class of animal, say that you are buying open grass-fed cows that are skinny and came up open and that are just culls, if you can get them fat within a month or two and direct market them as grass-fed ground beef, you can do not only one, but maybe 2 or 3 groups of those per growing season. So say you have a farm that can only hold 25 cows at a time. You could sell up to 75 head that way in the course of a year. Now that will really make a huge amount of progress on your overheads because the turnover rate is so massive at that point. Now if you're worried about losing your genetics, people might think that, hey, well, I don't want to flip because I love my cows, I have great cows, and I don't want to lose the genetics and have to start over all the time. There are solutions to that too. First of all, if you are doing like a breeding stock heifer thing like I'm going to be doing, I can always go to the people that I sell these heifers to and buy heifers back from them a couple years down the line so that I can keep reusing my same genetics. And I can also get feedback from the people who buy my animals to make sure that the ones I'm producing are functional and that they're not having problems once they leave my place. Now, the only things that could really be a problem that I see with this spring to fall flipping thing is the marketing. Because in this part of the country, nobody wants to buy anything going into the fall. And I totally understand why, because I'm up here telling you don't keep things for the winter. Marketing is going to be a lot easier from what I've heard if you can get potload sized lots together, which would be 45 to 50,000 pound lots of animals. Now my farm carrying capacity right now is only at 30,000, and so I have a ways to go. I've got to create some pasture improvements so that I can hold that number of animals. But this is something to consider. Now when you're planning a flip operation, you really need to have an eye on the cattle cycle and on the market in general, because you want to be producing what people want. You can't just say, okay, well, this is something that would be really easy for me to produce, and this is what I want to do, but it doesn't matter if I can sell it or not. It does matter. And so this is a diagram of a normal cattle cycle, which usually moves in about 10-year increments. This is from Beef Magazine, from Harlan Hughes' column. I stopped getting Beef Magazine a long time ago because they really have a super conventional lean, but the market columns are very, very useful, so I probably will start subscribing again. Anyway, so what happens here is basically that cattle numbers in the national cow herd have an inverse relationship to prices. And so when the national cow herd is at a really high level and everyone has tons of cows, they're not worth anything. But when cows are hard to come by, then the prices go down. This is what happened in about 2011 to 2012 when everybody started selling off cows because of the big drought down in cattle country. Prices went sky high in 13 and 14. Then they started coming down again last couple of years because it's raining and people are keeping everything. So now we have a lot more cattle out there. So this is something you've got to pay attention to. Even if you're not flipping, if you are trying to build a herd, you might want to vary the amount of stuff that you sell versus keep at different points in time based on where we are in the cattle cycle. So So when prices are low, you don't want to sell stuff because it's not worth anything. You want to keep it, and then you can start selling off a lot of stuff when it's at the peak of their value. Definitely don't buy stuff when prices are really high, because prices will come back down and you will be in a lot of trouble. Your success level in this flipping plan depends a lot on your level of education and keeping track of all these things on this list, which I'm not going to read off right now. But these are all things that play into cattle prices and cattle demand for every age and class of animal and every type of livestock product. So this is what I just talked about with historical cattle prices. And those gray bars there are the national cattle inventory, and that red bar represents the average prices of just cattle in general. Now we are, being in the grass-fed space, a little bit independent of this to a point where we do have some intrinsic value that can mitigate price downtrends for us, but we are still tied to this. And so it's a great idea to pay attention to stuff, even if you think you don't need to know about it. That was a past arrogant mistake of mine, where I used to think, oh wait, I don't need to know about this. I don't need to know about cattle or sheep, or I don't need to know about dairy, or I don't really need to know about how people do things out west or in other countries. You really do need to know about everything. You're never going to know when you would need to know it. Anyway, so as you can see, when the cow herd gets bigger, the prices are lower. And when the cow herd gets smaller, the prices go high. Pretty simple. Now, if you're thinking about the flipping idea at all, Bud Williams came up with a really good way to look at the markets and a really good strategy for when and how to buy and sell everything. I got his multiple hour DVD. It was a couple $100s, but I'm really glad that I got the DVD because it took me so many times fast forwarding and rewinding and pausing and stopping and making little notes. I had like a whole notebook full of just this DVD. But Bud has an innovative way of looking at things where you don't calculate profit from what you get for the animals versus what you paid for them. Your profit comes from taking what you got from your last set of animals compared to what you spend to get your next set. And it's kind of confusing when you first start looking at it because it's a total departure from everything that everybody else teaches and the way that we normally think about things. But look into Bud Williams' marketing teachings. It's really an eye-opener. Because in his philosophy, you want to keep or buy the stuff that is undervalued currently, and you want to sell the stuff that is overvalued when you compare their present value to their future value. So you kind of got to know what's coming. But like I said, that's not a mystery. It's pretty easy to figure out. So if you don't want to go seasonal, I know that it's not going to work for everybody. There are some ways to minimize your winter feed costs, because that really is our biggest problem here in this part of the country. If you still are open to the flipping idea, you can buy some bred cows in the spring, cow them out, and either rebreed and sell them in the fall, or you can process them for ground beef in the fall, and then you still have that stocker calf. Now you can keep that stocker over the winter, and that's going to cost you a heck of a lot less feed than keeping a whole cow herd over the winter. Like I said, you want to have more animals in the summer than you do in the winter in order to get anywhere past your overhead and past your feed costs. I can see this as being a lot less damaging to the ground because the animals are so much smaller and requiring less winter feed. But you do have the issues involved in weaning calves at about 6 months, right around that age, and you have the issues of needing higher quality feed if they're not going to be getting that supplemental nutrition from their mother's udder all winter. Now, if you don't want to flip it all, and you really just want to have your same genetics year-round, you want to do more of a traditional cow-calf plan, there are still some options that you can consider. Now, when I was watching Bud Williams' DVD, I stopped and thought all of a sudden, why do we keep the animals every year that have the highest sale value, that are potentially worth the most, and they eat the most, and they're the most expensive to keep around, and why do we sell the animals that are smallest, they potentially have less value in terms of gross cash income that can be generated compared to a cow, and they're the cheapest to keep around? And so I came up with this idea of doing a reverse cow-calf operation, where you want to keep your young stock and you want to maximize the selling of your adult cows every year. So if you're trying to keep a static herd size, you can sell potentially as many adult females as you have pregnant heifers to replace them every year without losing any herd size. Now, if you're trying to grow your herd, you can't sell quite that many. But I would recommend selling the cows at the peak of their value if you're going to sell them as breeding stock. So to keep them long enough for them to pay off what you have into them by the number of calves that they give you, and factor that into what you would sell them for, and then sell them as pregnant breeding stock before they start to lose value. And so it takes probably right around 3 or 4 calves to pay off a cow. Now you can sell them at that point once they've had 3 or 4 calves, but at that point they're already starting to get a little bit old. But if you wanted to sell them after they're their first or second calf, potentially with that calf at their side, you would just have to factor in any cost that you had in raising that animal that she has not yet covered for you in calf gain. But I really like this idea of selling young cows instead of selling your young stock if you want to be a breeding stock operation. This would maximize the amount of genetic turnover that you can realize within the number of generations that you're farming. Say that most people's farming careers are 20 to 40 years max. Well, if you're going to keep all of your older cows and keep selling all of the young stock that you have spent a whole lot of money on excellent bulls in order to produce, you still have 10-year-old genetics in your herd. Now, if you're selling all of your cows once they get to be productive, maybe young to middle-aged cows, and you're keeping all of your new heifers, your genetics are steadily improving every year. Because if you have an effective breeding program, each generation should, in theory, be better than the one before it. I just skipped one by accident. Yeah, I want to go back to this breeding value chart here. So you want to make sure that you sell them once they are before, like up to or before that peak. You don't want to wait until they start going down the slope there. If you don't like that idea and you really do think that you want to just raise cows and keep young stock, there are still a number of options to consider in getting those wintering costs down and in generating more cash flow. You can send herds out for custom wintering if your wintering costs are really just overwhelming for you to someone who can winter them for cheaper than you can. It may not necessarily be cheaper if you got to truck them a long way, but I think that it would be more natural. Because you don't see large herds of bison spending their winters in North Dakota, where there's 3 feet of snow all the time. They go south looking for better climates and better feed. And you would also get a vacation if you send your cows out for a couple of months during the year. If you don't want to do that, you just want to keep them home, you can outsource the non-producing classes that are just eating. So if you're a cow-calf operation and you want to sell weaned or yearling calves, and a lot of the time you have non-producing replacements that are on your place that are just growing and are not pregnant yet, or they're pregnant, they have not calved yet. You can maintain more pairs on your place if you get those heifers off for the amount of time when they are just eating and growing. Like in a dairy operation where you don't have your heifers in the barn with your lactating cows eating the same feed and taking up space. You have them off on another farm or in another barn. Same thing goes for bulls. Bulls are another thing that often just sit around and work a few months out of the year and then they just chill and they eat your feed and you have to worry about where to put them and how to keep them out of your neighbor's cow herd. So I rent my bulls out. My neighbor likes to use my bull for a couple $100s a year, and that gets him off my place so that he doesn't rebreed things too early, and it also generates enough income to cover the cost of having him for the year. If you don't want to rent bulls out, you can just buy a bull, use them for a few months, then sell them again. If it's a young bull, you can potentially do that at a profit, and so breeding can cost you nothing. Now, if you really just want to go, you don't like any of the ideas that I have set out so far, you can add a seasonal enterprise on top of your cow-calf herd in order to get your summer scale up and not have any additional wintering costs. Like I said, I haven't found a way where you can keep the same herd size, summer and winter, and get very far. Now, here's a word of caution about diversification. The diversification is great for risk management, and if you have a customer base that wants a whole bunch of different products and you have opportunities to sell a bunch of different things. But when you have enterprises that are both competing for the same resources, you are leaving money on the table if you are splitting your resources between an enterprise that generates a lot of profit and one that generates not so much. So if risk management is not that big of a deal to you, or if you're really strapped for time and you don't want to do a whole heck of a lot of work managing all these different things, it is the most cash effective to use 100% of your resources toward the enterprise that generates the most profit and the most gross margin, being a totally specialized operation. And so here, let's say I have 180 acres of pasture. Again, that's a number that I go to just because that's what I have. I have 3 different theoretical enterprises right now: cow-calf, finishing, and sheep. And then the bottom line on all of these is that gross margin per acre is different for each one. So with the finishing steers, $100 gross margin per acre, sheep $75, and cow-calf $60. So in this case, I'm losing money because I'm using that grass for things that do not generate $100 per acre. So 12.7, if I go with this plan that I have up here on the screen, but if I were to cut out everything except those finishing steers, I would end up with $18,000 from the same piece of property. And so diversification is only a good idea, in my viewpoint, if you have enterprises that don't compete with each other, and that they are things that can help cover the common overheads without taking resources away from one another. So say if you have grass-fed beef, you have a grazing operation for them, if you can run chickens behind them on the same piece of grass that do not take any grass away from the cattle, that does offer another income stream. And that's probably not going to be that much more work, since you can go out there and move the cows and then take care of the chickens at the same time. And I think I talked about all the rest of these bullets already. Risk mitigation and untapped opportunities to sell certain products. Now, if you have unused resources, such as a woodlot that you're not able to use in your primary enterprise, it could be a good idea to do another cash-producing enterprise with those resources. Because if you have a piece of land or property that you own or lease, that is one big overhead item, and you want to be squeezing as much cash out of that as you possibly can. Now, if you do choose just to go with one enterprise, the way that I am, I'm one person and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on trying to raise 5, 6, 7 different products. And so I am going to be doing my heifer operation, but I'm going to have byproducts from that, which are things like heifers that didn't breed. And I'm going to have bulls that I need to find something to do with. And so adding value to those byproducts will allow you to expand the number of things that you raise. And so my calves are going to go into ground beef, and that's going to give me another product that I can direct market and sell. And those bulls are going to allow me to start up a bull renting operation, and it'll allow me to make some bull sales too. So a lot of things just naturally turn into something else. And another thing that I do a lot of is brokering products from other farms. I have people coming to me sometimes wanting to buy steaks and buy meat. Well, all I really raise is some roast and some ground. And so if I want somebody that wants a bulk package, I go to a couple of friends of mine and I buy some steaks. And so that I can send those down the road to my customer, keep them happy, keep them coming back to me, help a friend out and increase their sales, and everybody's happy. And it didn't cost me anything to raise that steak. And if I wanted to raise that steak myself, I would have to completely rearrange my entire operation. And that's just not within the realm of what I want to do. A couple more topics quick, because we're getting about to lunchtime. Now, we all know that reducing winter feed is a good idea, but there is a point at which reducing your winter feed becomes not economical. So if you have too many cattle on a piece of ground, your production costs go sky high, your feed costs go sky high, because it's not sustainable and you end up with a feedlot. But if you have too few cattle, you may never need to feed a bale of hay year round, but you have 3 cows on 180 acres, your overhead cost will be astronomical, and you can't make it that way either. And so here's another multiple week project that I worked on a few years ago, coming up with what the optimum stocking rate is that will generate the most profit. And so, let's see, the hay cost and the direct cost are represented by that purple line, the dark line, and those go up as your stocking rate on any set amount of property increases, but your overheads go down as your enterprise stocking rate increases on that set amount of land. And so I figured that there had to be a point at which those two would cross. And when you combine those two charts together, you end up with this little parabola thing. And so the lowest cost number of pairs on this piece of land that I used as my test piece was right around 50. And so I found, basically, long story short, with marginal grass, the best stocking rate for this part of the country for an operation like mine is between 5 and 7 acres per cow-calf pair, if you were keeping them year-round. Now that grass is still not in excellent shape. It was a hay field for a couple years, but has mostly been sitting for the last 15. Now, if you have a piece of property where you have done a lot to improve the ground through high-density grazing or soil amendments, you're capable of a much higher stocking rate. And I found that the optimum for that type of situation is closer to 4 acres per pair per year. So it could be anywhere between those numbers, but that just kind of gives you a ballpark. What I want you to take away from it is that there is a point in which those two factors, your direct cost and your overheads, intersect. And so there is an optimum for every one of you. Custom grazing. This is another way that you can get 100% of your grass going into a cash-producing animal every year. But I do want to say that it's not a golden ticket, that there are some stipulations for it to work really well. Because a lot of people are super eager to get into it and super interested in it, but it probably is not going to work for a large number of people. First of all, two parties are trying to take a gross margin off of the same animal or the same pair. You've got two people trying to make money off the same animal. So therefore, the margin for both people is a lot slimmer than if it would be if you had only one person trying to make money. Because both the custom grazer and the owner both have to be in there. So what I found for the small herds that I've been custom grazing the last few years, between 15 and 20 pairs a year, is that in order for me to make what I need to make in order to rise above my overheads with the herd size that I can hold on my farm, the owner has pretty much got nothing left. To do that, or for the owner to be able to make money, I don't really get anything. So I think that for custom grazing to work, it really has to be on a huge scale. And you've got to be able to hold 75 to 100 head probably. You also need to have experience. A lot of the people that I've talked to who want to get into custom grazing are just getting started in the livestock business. And while it is a huge benefit for somebody who's just starting out from an income perspective, an owner wants to know that they are trusting their cattle or their livestock to somebody who is experienced and knows what they're doing and is not going to be trying to learn on your dime. And so it is something where you need at least a little bit of experience to be successful with. Otherwise, your custom grazing owners won't stick around too long if you're costing them a ton of money while you're trying to learn. And so I think that the proper use for custom grazing would be to send your animals out in order to get a non-producing class off your land so that you can expand the number that you have of a producing class. It can work on an individual farm basis, and so you just have to have an iron grasp on your numbers if you want to be either a custom grazer or if you want to send animals out to as an owner to somebody else. I think there are opportunities in the Northeast for this kind of thing, working with dairy farms, mostly for heifers, or dry cows possibly, and also working with large distributors of grass-fed beef as a finishing manager. And if you want to know more about custom grazing, talk more the nuts and bolts about it, email me for my contract. I'll send you what I use. And so here we are at the end, the take-home messages here. Long story short, what I've figured out is that if you just grow and scale without cutting back your direct costs per animal, your expenses are going to grow as fast as your revenue does, and you're just going to do a whole lot more work for the same amount of profits. The right way to be big is to have massive turnover compared to your overheads, and also to not produce during times of the year when it's costing you more to produce than what you're gaining out of it. Eliminate the opportunity cost in your operation by considering only going with one enterprise, the one that makes you the most possible money for your resources. Minimize the amount of grass that is going into an animal that does not give you any cash in any given year. And not only does feeding a cow to feed a calf take carrying capacity away from your stocker or finisher enterprise, if that's what you're doing, the cow also represents a reduction in the amount of value that grass has because of her maintenance requirements. So that's a double whammy. Flipping can solve this problem if you are able to buy and sell at the right prices. And one more thing I want to add in about that is that it may require you to borrow some capital up front, but that does not necessarily represent a cash flow problem. I have taken out a sizable loan for my heifer project this year, but no money has come out of my pocket yet. I'm paying it back in a lump sum once I sell those heifers in the fall, so that's not a cash drain on me. If you don't want to go that route, always think about selling cows at the peak of their value instead of waiting for them to degenerate down to just auction beef price. Think about maybe selling animals like cows that are higher value and very consumptive and keeping the ones that are cheaper to maintain. Watch the cattle cycle so that you know when it might be a good idea to buy or sell certain things. Because just because a plan works for 1 year doesn't mean it's going to work for the next year. You might want to think about becoming an adaptive operation that does something different every year based on what the environment around you is going through. I want to throw in a little piece about the Ranching for Profit School. This was a program that they advertised in the Stockman Grass Farmer that I went to a few years ago. Hands down, most valuable business school I've ever been to. It's about a 5-day program, and they only have these schools out west. I asked them why, and they said because nobody in the East really is serious enough about it. And I said, well, these are the people that really need to learn about this. It could be really valuable to us. So if you want to take a trip out west and spend almost $3,000 for tuition for one person, it's a great thing to go to, and it'll be totally worth it. This is their contact information, and so take a look at their website. So I've already pretty much talked about what I'm doing this year. I am switching out of the traditional cow-calf custom grazing operation, and I am becoming a seasonal heifer flipper. So I'm going to buy yearlings, get them pregnant, and sell them in the fall. And we will see how that goes. And I will have a lot to say about that as it goes along. So right now I have my cow herd for sale, some beautiful bred cows, young cows. I really hate to let them go, but I just don't think the wintering thing is going to work for me. I think I can do a lot more with my land and with my resources going with the seasonal plan. And so as long as this prototype for my operation works, the next step for me is going to be to increase my carrying capacity through land improvement so that I can do this on a higher scale. And that's about all I've got for today. Go back to the context slide here. Oh man, I don't have to scroll through this whole thing again, do I? Can you put the last slide up, please? The last one. Yep. Okay, so I just want to say thanks to everybody for sitting through this, because I know I've almost made you late for lunch at this point. And I know that some of these ideas, or maybe all of these ideas, won't work for you, but I hope that I have just made you think. I wanted to show you all the different angles that you should be looking at this from. And I may have given you more questions than answers, but there are people in this room who have those answers. So talk amongst yourselves. You can learn so much from each other. And I want to say thank you to the Grazing Conference Committee for picking me to stand up here. And I want to say thank you to Greg for teaching me everything I know. Thank you to my parents and for Jason for being here. And thank you above all, glory to God. Right now, or during the lunch period.
Question or two for Meg?
Yes?
Your acres per cow-calf pair, that's considering feeding them 365 days.
What I did with that projection was I assumed that as my herd size went up, I would need to feed more hay, and that's where the increase in direct costs come from. And so the amount of, so I have a 12-month period, and so as your herd size goes up, it's going to kind of slide back and forth between more hay to more grass, like a teeter-totter almost.
So you're either getting the grass off your farm or the hay off your farm in that acreage number?
I'm considering the hay as being purchased, and so if I say that I had a small herd as compared to what that property can hold, I'm grazing for maybe 10 or 11 months. Now I did put a seasonal limitation on there because I figured that I don't think you can really get down to less than 2 months in my area because of the snow. But if I had a big herd, the grass might only last me for 4 or 5 months out of the growing season, and the rest of the year in the balance would be hay. And so that's where I figured that the direct cost increase would come from as the herd size goes up.
Time for one more question.
Yes?
Have you worked with retained ownership as a variable in what you're doing?
I have not done that yet, but that's also a good option.
What was the question?
Oh, sorry. The question was, have I considered retained ownership of classes that have left my farm? That's something I did forget to put in here, but that's also a very good idea. Because that would allow you to maximize, say that you have a cow-calf herd, allow you to use all of your land for that, but also allow you to stock your and finish under your own ownership too. So that's a very good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, let's give Meg a round of applause. Thank you.